scholarly work. But of course, a lot of us go online to find out, hey, what is this book about? So I want to deal with that. And then this Balaam character and his trusty steed, what are they all about? Why are they in the book? What's the implications there? Because that's often over-spiritualized, as though he was a prophet. He was used in a sense as a forth-teller, but he was certainly not a man of God. I may have given away the whole point there, but we'll dig a little bit deeper into it if time allows. Okay, quick overview. Just for you that maybe you're not in the Old Testament very often or in the Pentateuch, you'll see the continuity in that book. There's huge overlaps between Genesis and Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. This is the Abrahamic covenant that we're talking about. So you should see a lot of overlap, and you should see God's promises being fulfilled and the people needing to be reminded of God's promises, even in that short period of time. So they're leaving Mount Sinai here now in the opening part of the book. They had a great start, ambitious, ready to go. God has just given them victory over Pharaoh's army. They are organized. There's a census taken of the men who are ready to fight and to conquer Canaan. They're good to go. It's a short journey, and then the wheels fall off. And so they begin to grumble. They begin to feel discontent. Their lack of faith comes at a culmination in chapter 25, where they refuse to go into the promised land. And so the primary lesson in the book is obedience and God's faithfulness. Those are two of the sides of the same coin. God promises, we must obey. God is faithful, we are to obey him in his faithfulness. So just a breakdown of the various sections, okay? We have the first 4 chapters, which is where there is that census of the people. It's quite an extensive one. And what I love about that census, although it's very hard to read it if you're just on a reading program in your Bible to get through it in a year, it's a bit of a drudgery just to read it. But it's what I like in God's sovereignty in leaving us the canon is the detail. And you can reverse engineer and say those numbers should be taken as actual figures, which we'll get into later. But just the clarity, the specificity, the particular clarity that he's given even by the various tribes and their duties. It's fantastic to have that on record. Then we have lots of moral laws and purification requirements of the people in chapter 19. Chapters 27 to 30, God gives instructions for this next generation. Remember, we had this unfaithful generation that refused to go into the land. And now we have, after that 20 years has passed, we have another generation that are ready to enter the promised land. Yeah. And then 31 to 36, that's the last section of this, where we have the war, the Midian war. In between those big census points, the first one and the second one, there is some confusing narrative, a little briefly, in chapter 3, which we'll look at Balaam's oracles, which is kind of a poetic prophecy that God has given him. Literary devices together can be a bit confusing, but at the end of the day, you just follow the text. There is a flow, there is a purpose of its seemingly out of order sequence in some places. But you'll see, basically, they leave Sinai finally. They go into the wilderness. They come to an area of wandering, and this Kadesh Barnea area, which is translated. Then finally, the plains of Moab, where they have another battle. King Balak is not too happy of this covenant with Abraham. It makes a lot more sense. It's a lot easier to follow the flow, because there are no clean breaks between these Noetic books. You have that Genesis to Joshua sequence of events with lots of cross-referencing, but just reading it through. They've been promised a land of their own, and yet they're still at the end of this book have not received that promised land. So, 2 sections. The first section is the disobedient first generation from chapters 26. It does prepare to enter. I spent a lot more time looking in particular at the rebellion of Israel, which is going to be related to, in light of the rebellion, is what we'll look at this morning. And then the last one will be his faithfulness. And then I'll look at a couple more, his holiness, but just very briefly, his provision as a God, his protection. But we'll spend a bit of time on those. And then we'll look at those theological challenges, implications. All right, main themes. And I'm trying to keep my eye on the clock more this morning, but are we good to go? All right, let's move forward. Let's look at his patience. 14, 18, and 19, that the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. It's actually a quote from the previous book in Exodus, where Moses is receiving the Ten Commandments, right? The stone tablets on Mount Sinai, and God has descended in a cloud, and he's Moses. But here in Numbers, why is Moses referring to this? He's recounting who God is to God himself, because remember, he's interceding for the sins of the people. And he's reminding them of his patience. He says in verse 18, steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgressions. If we read that whole section in Numbers 14, 18 to 19, he continues, but children, to the third and the fourth generation. And in verse 19, please pardon the iniquity of this people. So Moses reminding him, you are a God of forgiveness, and you've forgiven us before, and I'm just imploring you, forgive us once again. The rebellion of the nation. Remember, they had rabblers in their midst. They weren't part of the chosen people. They're grumbling about the conditions. They're unhappy with how simple the provisions were, and longing to be back where they were rich in nutrition and food and spice and even onions. Actually, the Israelites, they joined in the discontentment. Even though he's continuing to protect them, he's continuing to guide them, literally feeding them daily. And what happens? God does indeed hear that complaining. And in chapter 11, verse 1, what's his response? His anger was kindled. Now, that doesn't sound like a patient God. Well, let's look more closely at how this happened. Of his righteous anger to even wipe them out completely, but instead he just burns and causes fire on the outskirts of the camp. And again, Moses intercedes even for that, and God quenches the fire. So in that immediate response, and that understanding that this is God who is now giving us our just punishment, they still continue to complain. And it even escalates into weeping that we look at verse 4. And again, as I mentioned last week, it's not a kind of, entitled. It's a weeping of complaint. They're complaining about their circumstances. It's a self-pity kind of weeping of the worst kind. It's a toddler versus a teenager. And well, even today that's getting more confusing. But the immediate reaction versus the thought-out, heartfelt sorrow, it's that kind of comparison. And that continues all the way up to chapter 14. And remember, these are people who know, they're the first generation. They know of their captivity that they've been released from, of Pharaoh's army. The miracle of parting of the Red Sea, the daily provision. They know they're being led to the promised land. And yet still grumbling. And that discontent, those rabblers who are amongst them, the spies returned after bringing some fruit, but described the conquering as impossible. They're too strong for us. The fortifications are too difficult. And they grumbled to Moses and Aaron. And now this escalated to full-on rebellion when they defied God by not entering the promised land. And then they turned this anger even to Joshua and Caleb, who were also trying to convince them of their ability to win. Because why? Not because of their strength. They didn't take another census. They didn't count their arrows or their bows. They just said, God said he will go forth before us and make it winnable. He will send an angel of the Lord. That should have been enough, but no, they were just focusing on their immediate circumstances. And they turned from the Lord. They refused then to give God the glory, give him the honor, even in their survival in the desert. He'd been faithful up until then, yet they turned to despise him. But this section is not just God handing out just punishment, but I remember touching on the point that this was also God's test of Moses. What is Moses going to do in this moment where he's going to be punishing his people? He's testing like he did at the burning. He doesn't think of a clever way to get them out of this predicament, but simply reminds God of who he is. And this is where we come to the patience of the Lord. And he reminds him that, Lord, you are slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, because of who you are, because of your immutable character as our God. Would you please pardon this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love? And he does, but not without consequence. He will not see the promised land, as recorded in verse 23. So the lesson is that sin, but there are consequences. That forgiveness, if the forgiveness is to be just, there needs to be a cost, a consequence. And them all. And as surely as witnesses, they could have seen God could have destroyed them all. They witnessed his power. They witnessed these miracles. They witnessed the fire even burning the edge of the camp that stopped. They complain. They complain more to Moses and Aaron initially, but then angered the Lord. But despite all their complaining and all the ways that they did sin against him, he remained patient with them. And so the implications for us is that God is merciful, incredibly long-suffering and merciful. And we're going to look at that word. I just want you to think a moment about that. Patience, the way it's often defined in our own human and fallible way. What are we patient about? We are sometimes proud of ourselves when we're patient in heavy traffic. We need patience for those things because we can't see them coming. And that's not the kind of patience that God needs. And why not? Well, God doesn't need patience to bear the surprise or the unexpected events. Substantial patience, which the Israelites were demonstrating, they didn't have. So when he speaks of patience, we're not talking about God enduring hard times or frustrating events. We're talking here, describing patience about being long-suffering toward a disobedient people, a sinful people. And patience in Hebrew is often translated slow to anger, meaning that the anger is righteous and just, but it is slow to build up. The Hebrew word is erek, and you find it used about 15 times in the Old Testament, and often translated as long-suffering or patience, but it needs to be unpacked. Slow to anger point, grace upon grace before it's delivered. And in the New Testament word patience, it's also translated into long-suffering, macrothumio, and it's used about 25 times in the New Testament. And it can be translated in a better way, taking a long time to boil in the Greek. That's a fuller unpacking of that. So that's the image, taking a long time to boil. And if you have an electric oven versus a gas oven, you'll see the difference. I prefer gas because it's quick to cook, quick to boil, whereas electric's not so much. That's a terrible. He's not disproportionate in the anger that he reaches. It's not irrational. It's not unjust. And it is slow to get there. And God cannot be patient with circumstances that frustrate us because he knows them. Circumstances are not moral or amoral. They're not evil or not evil or holy. They're just events. So that's not what God's dealing with here compared to the people. He is patient with them because of their hearts and impatient because of their evil. Oh, sorry. I already had that last slide up, or point, sorry. So he's slow to boil, which is also important to point out that he's slow to anger with people, and not because he is surprised by their actions also. I mean, being sovereign, circumstances obviously don't anger God because he knows they will happen. And he knows the behavior and the hearts of men. But it does grieve him, and that grief later escalates to anger because it continues. It doesn't stop, even though he gives them the grace and the room for it to stop. And that grieves and angers the Lord, and as it should with us. So the patience of God is not circumstantial. The patience of God is knowable by his word, and his restraint is remarkable when you look at how he is sovereign over all things. The fact that he allows people to continue in their sin, waiting for them, patience with them. The other side of that coin is the faithfulness that he demonstrates regardless. Even at the Passover, God passes them over for the firstborn child. Then to Pharaoh of God's power and his faithfulness. And these miracles demonstrate not just when he will, not just his faithfulness in his capacity to be all-knowing and to be powerful and to be patient circumstances. He may change, he won't change his will, his decreed will does not change, but he may change the timeline. He may change he is unaffected by the sinful hearts and the disobedience of his people. Or you could say mankind in general, because 23:19, you want to look, if you want to turn there, this is the context in this passage. We'll get to Balaam, but I had to put this first. The king of the Midianites, Balak, is coming to this sorcerer, this pagan prophet, to try to use him to evoke their god and to bring about a curse on them. Now, of course, the king doesn't know he will go to God, but he thinks he could just put a curse on them. Balaam coming to God. And in this section, in verse 19 of chapter 23, God is describing his own character here. And how does he do it? He describes his character best by describing the opposite of who they are. God is not man, that he should lie, or a son of man, that he should change his mind. He has said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? So here he's identifying what it means to be immutable, that he's completely reliable, he's unlike man. And whatever God, and he is wholly imperfect in all of his attributes that make him God. Another example is actually part of the continuing faithfulness that starts in Genesis. He has already made a covenant. This is part of the Abrahamic covenant. To have a nation, to have a great number of offspring, as plentiful as the stars. Oh, sorry, I meant to put that passage up. I'm ahead of you guys. So now if you want to look at Genesis 15, even though this isn't in this book, this is the beginning of God's faithfulness demonstrated even in Exodus stars. If you are able to number them, then he said to him, so shall your offspring be as you look at these number of stars. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So God is now counting his belief in what God has said as righteousness. Abraham is trusting in the Lord. Numbers, we can see that Even though God must deal with the disobedience and the rebellion of the nation of Israel, he demonstrates his faithfulness by keeping his covenant with them, by even providing for them in the rebellion, by even protecting them when they refuse to honor him, and even bringing them victory when they refuse to fight, and bringing them into the promised land by the protection of his hand. So that's an example of a theme of faithfulness. I don't have the time to go through all of them, but these are some of the bigger points that if you understand, starting in Genesis, his promises made and kept and realized in this book, it helps you see that that's a big theme. There's just a couple of more. The chosen people, various laws and holiness commandments, and he even describes tassels that must be put on in a particular place, in a particular arrangement. And then he explains why he gives them these very specific, do all of my commandments, and to be holy to your God. So these visual things help them to be reminded, while God is decisive and he's very particular about his justice that he delivers to 14, which we did look at last week. Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. So here, God pardons, but he's also saying, even in that, even in your disobedience, my glory will fill of the Lord and his covenant to his people, that he's even able to forgive them, because forgive them of the rebellion and even their idolatry, worshiping of false gods, turning completely from him. Even in that, holiness. They despise him, but he remains faithful and holy and just and merciful. Now, the part you've been waiting for, the population. If we look here at the first part, chapter 1, there are several, well, there's two main places in Numbers where these large figures are given, and very particular figures. They are slightly rounded up, but that's neither the here nor there. That round, when I say rounded up, to like to the 10th, to the 10 digit, not to the 1,000 or the 10,000. It's very accurate as far as census goes. And the descriptions also of the battles, we see a very particular list of numbers of soldiers, and of the victories from those battles, a number of animals that they could share and split between them, like herds and sheep and so on. But in Numbers 145, we see this. So all those listed of the people of Israel by their fathers' houses, from 20 years old and upward, every man able to go to war in Israel, 46, all those listed were 603,550. Now, some argue that the census figure in this chapter is too large for this ancient civilization, certainly too large for a desert society, especially now that they're going to be wandering out completely dependent on God. And they say, well, it's only counting the fighting men. So why would it exclude the others? Well, it doesn't necessarily. We know it is only counting the fighting men, but it says it's not counting the Levites. It doesn't have to say it's not counting the women, because the point of the census is not to count the population, but the what? Fighting men of Israel. So we know the reason for it. So some liberals find a way then to translate the Hebrew word elip, which is the Hebrew word for 1,000, into means something completely different. Maybe something smaller, obviously. So they have these hermeneutic gymnastics to try to say, well, in this context only, elip means clan, let's say, or battalion, or something not that means 1,000 everywhere else in Hebrew, which isn't a very convincing argument, because that changes the meaning of that usage, that number, in every other context. So it makes counting impossible in Hebrew, in any other book, and makes it meaningless. Other scholars, of course, just assume the narrative is ahistorical, and so I don't even know why they study the Old Testament, to be honest, because that's where we get our foundations for who God is to his people. It describes his character. So to study this and say, well, it's not really history, you might as well be reading Moby Dick. It always amazes me when they write very long and very particular papers on what they're reading is untrue or impossible. Yeah. But the simple solution in this population dispute is clear, I think. The number must be taken as it's given. You got to keep in mind that this census was again to fight the men of Israel. It wasn't meant to count the number of women or babies, but you can extrapolate because of a normal family unit. These are the men who would, again, of course, enter the promised land. So it's to count the cost for war. It's an intentional count. It's a gender-specific count. And it's counted in a particular way by tribe. So I think very precise. And so once you include the Levites, the older people, the women, the children, you could come up with a figure from 600,000 to close to 2 or 3 million, 2.5. If you're multiplying it by 3 or 4, you will come up with millions. And of course, one of the arguments is that there were too many. You couldn't have that large of a population in any age, for example, of the slaves numbering that many. But you should also note that in Egyptian history, there's no mention of the slavery. Pharaoh didn't record the plagues either. He didn't record the release of the slaves, nor did he record the death of his entire army. He didn't record bad news that made the Pharaoh look bad, was not recorded. And next is the problem of the practicality problem of leading this massive group around the temple, feeding them. We know they left Egypt, though. We do know from the departure they were given animals by Pharaoh, right? Herds of animals. And even in proportion to feed them. So that's possible, it's plausible. But we also know that God promised to provide for them their daily need through manna, through shade of cloud during the day, which otherwise they'd be scorched, and by night, light and heat by fire, the pillar of fire. So these are important. This is actually vital in this whole narrative. Sustaining them in these elements could only be done through God's provision. So I agree with the argument that it's hard to believe that millions of people in a wasteland could make it on their own. Agreed. I have no problem with that argument. But that isn't the argument. The argument is that for 40 years they were sustained by God's hand. So that is the point, that God provided. And he provided in a very specific way. And he provided daily. And he recorded how he provided. And that's how we see how they survived. We know that's how they survived, because they even God's daily provision for years. So God, some scholars will argue, God could provide for the 603,000. They don't argue that that's a problem. But somehow, when it goes over 1 million or 2 million, that's impossible. Have you ever seen a crowd of 600,000 people? It might as well be 2 million when it comes to logistics. And especially over impossible, even with our modern abilities to keep 600,000 people alive in a desert that goes from plus 45 to minus 20 every day for 2 weeks. But to do it for 40 years, that is God's provision. So whenever the pragmatic and interpretive solutions are offered, there's always a clear solution to simply read the numbers as they appear. He's the one who's protecting, he's the one who's providing. Yeah, any questions on that? Because even another very interesting thing in the number, promising that first generation will pass away, and we think, well, they'll be decimated. But actual change in population from beginning to end is about more faithful, more obedient, less rebellious. That's an interpretive issue on its own. But you see, it wasn't consistent within yet at the end, the number was about 1%. Incredible. Any questions on that, though? Because it actually is still a big problem. If you look at a lot of commentaries, oh, seriously, but we should, because it's an amazing feat. Yeah, Peter. Yeah, 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 yeah. And some of the evidence, yeah, yeah. And when you look at how God protects and provides, surrounds them, and he's only doing it with this people, it kind of makes sense that their population is going to grow relative to the other ones around them. They will be decimated because they're living in an same environment, but without God's provision and protection. So it doesn't matter that they're moving around. What they need to survive, God provides. So they're going to grow. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And even in the victories, they're always conquering herds. But yeah, but still, in the initial part, yeah, 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 yeah. You, still, absolutely. Peter, yeah, yeah, mm, yeah. It's a wasteland, so it's not sand. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what amazes me. The more you actually look into the detail of his provision and the scale of their complaining, it doesn't make sense. Other than the human heart, the sinful nature of the heart is the only answer. All right, Balaam, quickly. All right, how to summarize this quicker than I have in my notes here. Okay, King of Moab. He sees, in fact, this is kind of proof to what we were just saying, that there's huge numbers. Because this king, Balak, not Barack Obama, but, but just Balak, he saw them conquering around the nations around them. He saw their numbers and he was afraid. So he's now hiring this hitman, the spiritual hitman, Balaam. And so he called him. He's basically a sorcerer, a diviner, a hired man for putting curses on people. And he says, "Come now, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me." He sees they're huge in numbers. So Balaam, he's hired by Barak. Didn't use drones like Barak did, but this is different, Barak, to weaken them in exchange for what? Now, this is the first clue that he's not a man of God, even though in some translations it's called prophet. And in a lot of the Sunday school material that is used in evangelical churches is that he was used by God, therefore he's of God. He did it for money. He's looking for a reward. He wasn't looking to honor the king even necessarily, which we'll see at the end. Just wanted to get paid. So Balaam was willing to do this, but he wanted to speak to God. Not sure why, but Balaam is not somebody who's speaking to God because he trusts in God. In several places in the account, we read him invoking the name of God. So there's some people say, well, he's saying the Lord of Israel. He's saying the Lord, my God. But he's not using the term that they use. He's not saying Yahweh or the Lord, our covenantal God. He's just saying, and he's not saying my personal God. He would just use any God in general. Whatever God that he had to speak to, he would just speak to that God in his mind. a god of many gods, let's put it that way, not his redeemer. So he's a pagan diviner who would evoke any name for payment. And in this instance, he expected their Lord, not his God, to speak to him. And God does. And he implores, or tries to implore Yahweh, their God, on behalf of this king for reward. But what happens? All that he can do is praise Israel. All he can do is speak well of them and their blessed communion and covenant with God. Hero of the story. He's not the main point of this story either. God is the hero that happened to use this pagan diviner. Then there's the donkey. On one occasion, the donkey sees this angel. He tries to stop from going towards this fierce, fighting, sword-wielding angel. And Balaam jumps off the donkey, beats him, and then the donkey rebukes him. He opens his mouth, says, "Don't beat me." Then the Lord opens Balaam's eyes in verse 31, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing there with a sword drawn. And the angel said to him, "It's because of the donkey that you're alive." Basically, that's what he said. So now back to the Sunday school problem with this, all right? Some might have said in these Sunday school curriculum, so the donkey spoke, and he saw the angel. So the donkey is being used as a hero. No, that's not the lesson here either. The donkey should not be the memorable part of this account, all right? The lesson here is that God can use anything, even a dumb beast, to impart his wisdom and to shame the wise. And so Balaam is humbled even through this donkey. So the theological imperative here is that as much as Balak wanted to use Balaam to bring a curse upon his people, all he could do is bless them. All he could do is praise them. From all the peaks of Moab, all of his oracles to them was poetry praising them. And I wish I could spend a bit more time, but we're running out of time. He says this, "How can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced?" That's in 23, verse 8. And the third message is where Balak really gets angry here, the king. "What have you done to me?" he says in verse 11. "I took you to curse my enemies, and behold, you have done nothing but bless them." So it should be clear here that they're not looking after God's people, what's best for them. And nor is he a prophet of God after God's own heart. That is not who Balaam is. In this narrative, we see him simply a greedy man for hire who uses witchcraft or any kind of craft for financial reward. And because Balaam was a pragmatist, this is the final point. This is the part. I don't want you to remember the donkey. I want you to remember this part. How did they achieve their end? Because they did. They cursed the people. Well, they didn't curse the people. The people were cursed. He devised another craft, not his witchcraft, not his sorcery. He seduced them. He was able to tempt the people of Israel with the women, and he turned them to pagan idol worship of Baal. So he knew he could not bring about a curse on the nation themselves, but he could lead them into sin so that they would curse themselves. That is the point of this. With the help of Balak, the king, Balaam led them into sin, to worshiping the Baal of Peor and committing fornication with the Mennonite women. And Moses records their moral failure here in chapter 25. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. And these invited the people to the sacrifice of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked herself to the Baal of Peor. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel again. No surprise. So what happens next? The plagues. 24,000 men died. And Balaam's the lessons learned here are referred to many times in the New Testament. Peter compares this event and Balaam's action to false teachers in 2 Peter 2:15. He says, "Who love the wages of wickedness And Christ even speaks of this event in Revelation 2:14, where he says to the church of Pergamum of their sin, he says this, "There are some among you who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin, so that they ate food sacrificed to idols and committed sexual immorality." Imagine that being the account of your church. Wow. So Balaam is by no means a man after God's own heart. He's looking to bring glory to himself. And the point of this is to remind the nations around them at that time that they are a people of God. Because even Balaam, even all the convincing from all the proclamations, all the oracles simply praise them. But God, I should say this, Balaam couldn't tempt them to sin. He couldn't bring a curse about them, but he could lead them to it. And they did it themselves. But even in that, God is glorified, and they were eventually redeemed as they came into repentance. I think I should probably stop. I have one more thing on implications, but let me just leave it there. I can maybe email it to you or something. Any questions? Because I have 1 minute, 2 minutes, if I stretch it. Yes, Shantan. In my Sunday school curriculum, he did. But you're right. You're right. You got to remember he's a sorcerer. Imagine the other things that he probably saw. Probably. That's he must have been up to all sorts of evil things and evoked evil things even. So for him, maybe he did see it before. I don't know. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. Okay. All right.